Tower Green, February 12, 1554. A 17-year-old girl kneels before a wooden block, her hands trembling as she reaches blindly through the black silk tied across her eyes. "Where is it?" she whispers, her voice barely audible above the February wind that cuts through the tower walls like a blade. The executioner's axe gleams in the pale morning light, waiting to end the shortest reign in English history. 9 days that condemned a brilliant young woman to die for a crown she never wanted. The gathered witnesses watch in stunned silence as Lady Jane Grey, once proclaimed Queen of England, gropes desperately for the block that will serve as her final pillow. Just months earlier, she had been reading Plato in Greek while her family hunted in the grounds of their grand estate. Now she stretches out her arms and speaks her last words. "Lord, into thy hands I commit my soul." But how does a teenaged girl, fluent in 5 languages, raised in luxury, destined for scholarly pursuits, find herself here, on this blood-soaked scaffold? Was she truly the innocent victim of ruthless political ambition, as history would later claim? Or was there something more complex, more devastating about the forces that shaped her fate? The axe falls with a single, decisive stroke. In that moment, England loses not just its briefest monarch, but perhaps its most tragic one. A girl whose greatest crime was being born into a world where her royal blood became both her blessing and her curse. Lady Jane Grey entered the world around 1537 at Bradgate Park, a magnificent Tudor mansion set amid the rolling hills of Leicestershire. Born into extraordinary privilege, she was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII and great-niece to the fearsome Henry VIII himself. Her lineage was impeccable. Royal blood flowed through her veins from both sides, making her one of the most eligible young women in all of England. From her earliest years, Jane displayed a voracious appetite for learning. That astonished even her well-educated tutors. While other noble children struggled with basic Latin, Jane was devouring classical texts in their original Greek. She mastered Hebrew, French, and Italian with an ease that suggested divine gift rather than mere study. Her tutors marveled at her sharp wit and philosophical mind. Here was a girl who could debate theology with bishops and discuss Aristotle with university scholars. Yet even as Jane's intellectual gifts flourished, something darker lurked beneath the surface of her gilded childhood. Her parents, Henry and Frances Grey, were ambitious beyond measure. They saw in their brilliant daughter not a person to be cherished, but a chess piece to be strategically positioned in the dangerous game of Tudor succession. Jane's education, for all its excellence, came with strings attached. Every language learned, every text mastered, was designed to make her more valuable in the marriage market. The young Jane found solace in her books, often choosing to remain in her chamber with Plato rather than join the hunting parties that delighted her parents. When the scholar Roger Ascham visited Bradgate, he discovered her reading alone while the entire household pursued their sport in the deer park. Her explanation would haunt those who knew her. She found more pleasure in her studies than others found in their games. None who met the young Lady Jane could have predicted that this brilliant, gentle soul would one day face the executioner's block. But in the Tudor court, intelligence and royal blood were dangerous gifts, and Jane Grey possessed both in abundance. At 15, Jane's world shattered in the most devastating way possible, through betrayal, disguised as honor. The blow came not from an enemy, but from those who claimed to love her most. In May 1553, Jane found herself standing in Durham House, the London residence of the powerful Dudley family, wearing a wedding gown she had never wanted to put on. Beside her stood Lord Guildford Dudley, a handsome but arrogant young man she barely knew, chosen not for love but for political convenience. The marriage had been arranged by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in England during the young King Edward's reign. Jane had protested the union with every fiber of her being. She understood, with her brilliant mind, exactly what was happening. She was being sold like livestock to secure an alliance between ambitious families. But her objections were met with what court records coldly describe as the urgency of her mother and the violence of her father. Behind those clinical words lay a brutal reality. Jane was beaten into submission, her spirit broken by the very people who should have protected her. The wedding ceremony proceeded with all the pomp befitting two great houses, but Jane's heart was already dying. She had dreamed, perhaps naively, of a marriage based on mutual respect and intellectual companionship. Instead, she found herself shackled to a spoiled young man who expected her to make him king through her royal bloodline. Guildford's arrogance was matched only by his mother's favoritism. The Duchess of Northumberland made no secret of her son being her preferred child, indulging his every whim. As Jane stood before the altar, speaking vows that felt like signing her own death warrant, she could not have known how prophetic her despair would prove. This marriage, forced upon her through violence and manipulation, would drag her inexorably toward a throne she never sought, and a grave she would reach far too soon. The girl who once found joy in Plato's dialogues now found herself trapped in a political tragedy that would make Greek drama seem merciful by comparison. The intellectual paradise of her childhood was over. The nightmare of her brief, doomed reign was about to begin. Within weeks of her forced marriage, whispers began to snake through the corridors of power like poison in the bloodstream. Lady Jane Grey, they said, was becoming difficult, unstable, perhaps even mad. The court watched with hungry eyes as Jane struggled to adjust to her new reality. When she refused to name her husband Guildford as king alongside her potential queenship, the gossips pounced. "Unnatural," they murmured. "What wife defies her husband so brazenly?" When she was seen reading alone instead of socializing with the other noble wives, they called it antisocial behavior. When she spoke passionately about her Protestant faith, they whispered of religious mania. But those who looked closer saw something different entirely. Jane's so-called madness was actually crystal clear sanity in an insane world. She understood, with terrifying clarity, that she was being used as a pawn in a deadly game. Her refusal to crown Guildford king wasn't defiance. It was the desperate act of a brilliant young woman trying to maintain some shred of agency in a life that was no longer her own. The Duke of Northumberland watched these developments with calculating eyes. If Jane appeared unstable, it might actually serve his purposes. A malleable, uncertain queen would be easier to control than a confident one. He began to encourage the narrative that Jane was fragile, overwhelmed by the weight of her destiny. Court observers noted how she would sometimes seem paralyzed by indecision, how she would tremble when discussing matters of state. What they failed to recognize was that Jane's trembling came not from madness, but from a profound understanding of the horror unfolding around her. She could see the trap closing, could sense the approaching catastrophe with the same intellectual precision that had once helped her master ancient languages. The girl who had debated theology with bishops now found herself speechless with terror, as she realized that her brilliant mind, her greatest gift, had become her greatest curse. The narrative was set. Lady Jane Grey was unstable, unpredictable, perhaps unfit to rule. Soon, this carefully crafted perception would become the justification for the ultimate betrayal that awaited her. On July 6, 1553, 15-year-old King Edward VI drew his final breath, and with it, the carefully constructed world of Lady Jane Grey began its violent collapse. In the dying king's chamber lay a document that would seal Jane's fate, Edward's will, naming her as his successor to the English throne. The decision bypassed his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, both declared illegitimate, and even Jane's own mother Frances, who had been removed from the succession line. Jane, the brilliant teenager who wanted nothing more than to study philosophy, suddenly found herself at the center of the most dangerous political crisis in Tudor history. But Edward's will was legally questionable at best. Parliament had never ratified it, and it directly contradicted both the Third Succession Act of 1544 and Henry VIII's own will, which clearly established Mary Tudor as Edward's rightful heir. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, knew this, but he also knew that without Jane's claim to the throne, his family's meteoric rise to power would end in catastrophic fall. 3 days after Edward's death, Jane received a summons to Sion House, Northumberland's unfinished palace. She arrived expecting a routine council meeting. Instead, she was met by a circle of the most powerful men in England, Dudley himself, along with Francis Hastings, William Herbert, William Parr, and Henry Fitzalan. Her own parents stood among them, their faces masks of ambition and terror. "The king is dead," Dudley announced with theatrical gravity. "Long live the Queen." Jane fainted. When she recovered consciousness, the reality of her situation became horrifyingly clear. These men, including her own father, were asking her to claim a throne that rightfully belonged to her cousin Mary. They were asking her to commit treason, to risk not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she loved. When Jane initially refused, they surrounded her with what court records euphemistically call prayers and caresses, a combination of emotional manipulation and veiled threats that finally broke her resistance. On July 10, 1553, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England, France, and Ireland. She was 16 years old, terrified, and completely powerless despite her new title. The girl who had once found refuge in books now discovered that all the learning in the world couldn't save her from the brutal mathematics of Tudor politics. Queen Jane's reign lasted exactly 9 days, 9 days that would echo through history as a masterclass in political delusion and human tragedy. From the moment she entered the Tower of London to prepare for her coronation, Jane existed in a state of surreal limbo. She wore the crown jewels that felt like shackles, sat on a throne that seemed more like a scaffold, and signed documents with hands that trembled not from excitement, but from sheer terror. Every proclamation issued in her name was a step closer to the abyss, yet she had no choice but to keep walking forward. Meanwhile, across England, a counter-revolution was brewing with a stunning speed. Mary Tudor, the rightful heir, had gathered forces in East Anglia and was marching toward London with an army that grew larger by the hour. The English people, whatever their religious differences, recognized legitimacy when they saw it, and Mary, daughter of Henry VIII, had what Jane Grey never could: an unquestionable claim to the throne. The collapse came with breathtaking swiftness. Within days, Jane's supporters began melting away like snow in summer. Even her own father, the Duke of Suffolk, abandoned her cause. In one of history's most devastating betrayals, Suffolk himself proclaimed Mary as the rightful queen, leaving his own daughter isolated and defenseless in the Tower. Jane received the news of her abandonment with a composure that spoke to her remarkable courage. She had always known this moment would come. Her brilliant mind had calculated the odds from the very beginning. When the Privy Council arrived to inform her that her reign was over, she reportedly responded with quiet dignity. "I am glad to relinquish a crown which has never been pleasing to me." But even as Jane surrendered the throne she had never wanted, a more terrible realization was dawning. In Tudor England, there was rarely mercy for failed claimants to the crown. Jane's brief reign, however reluctant, however manipulated, had made her a traitor in the eyes of the law. The girl who had been forced onto the throne by others' ambitions now faced the ultimate consequence of their machinations. As Mary Tudor's forces took control of London, Jane found herself transformed from reluctant queen to doomed prisoner in the space of hours. The Tower of London, which had briefly been her palace, now became her jail. The crown jewels were removed, the royal apartment sealed, and Jane Grey, brilliant, gentle, tragically naive Jane Grey, began her final journey toward a date with the executioner's axe. The girl who had once read about Greek tragedies was now living in one. The transformation was as swift as it was brutal. One moment Jane was England's reluctant queen. The next, she was prisoner number one in the Tower of London's bloodiest chapter. The order came directly from Mary Tudor herself, delivered with the cold efficiency that would define the new queen's reign. Lady Jane Grey, her husband Guilford Dudley, and her father the Duke of Suffolk were to be immediately committed to the Tower on charges of high treason. The girl who had fainted at her own coronation now faced the stark reality that her 9-day reign might cost her everything, including her life. Jane was 17 years old, 17, with decades of life stretching ahead of her, decades she now realized might be measured in weeks or months rather than years. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her with suffocating force as she was escorted through the Tower's massive gates, past the same crowds who had cheered her arrival as queen just days before. The betrayal cut deepest when it came from those who should have protected her. Her own father, Henry Grey, had proclaimed Mary queen to save his own skin, abandoning his daughter to face the consequences alone. The Duke of Northumberland, the architect of this entire catastrophe, scrambled desperately to curry favor with Mary, publicly renouncing his Protestant faith and taking Catholic communion in a pathetic attempt to save himself. Jane watched these betrayals with a mixture of heartbreak and grim understanding. She had always known that Tudor politics was a deadly game, but experiencing the abandonment firsthand was still devastating. The brilliant young woman who had once debated theology with scholars now found herself utterly alone, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed the final moments of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and countless other victims of royal ambition. In those first days of imprisonment, Jane might have taken some comfort in the knowledge that Mary had initially shown mercy. Her father was quickly pardoned, and there was hope that Jane herself might escape with her life. But hope, in the Tower of London, was often the cruelest torture of all. The girl who had been forced to play queen was now learning the price of that unwanted role. The Tower of London had been built to break spirits, and Lady Jane Grey discovered that her exceptional intelligence offered no protection against its grinding brutality. Her quarters, though befitting a former queen, became a luxurious cage that grew smaller with each passing day. The stone walls, thick enough to muffle screams, pressed in on her with psychological weight that no amount of classical education could alleviate. The girl who had once roamed freely through vast libraries now measured her world in paces: 12 steps to the window, 8 to the door, 15 from wall to wall. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. Jane's carefully maintained appearance began to deteriorate as the reality of her situation sank deeper into her bones. Her once lustrous hair grew dull and unkempt. The elegant gowns that had marked her royal status were replaced by simpler, increasingly worn clothing. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes as sleep became elusive, her brilliant mind torturing her with endless calculations of her probable fate. The physical privations were cruel enough, but the psychological torture was worse. Jane was cut off from all news of the outside world, left to imagine what plots might be brewing, what mercy or vengeance Mary might be planning. The isolation was particularly devastating for someone whose life had been built around intellectual discourse and scholarly debate. The girl who had thrived on conversation with learned men now had only her own thoughts for company, thoughts that grew darker and more desperate with each passing day. Her captors monitored her every movement, every visitor, every letter. When correspondence was allowed, it was read, censored, and often withheld entirely. Jane's connection to her sisters Catherine and Mary was severed. Her mother Frances remained mysteriously absent from any rescue attempts. Even more crushing was the knowledge that her husband Guilford, imprisoned in the Beauchamp Tower nearby, might as well have been on another continent. The tower's dampness seeped into her bones during the harsh winter months. Jane, raised in the comfort of great houses with roaring fires and rich tapestries, now shivered in chambers where cold seemed to live in the very stones. The food, while adequate, lacked the refinement she had known, but hunger was the least of her concerns. Her appetite had largely vanished under the weight of impending doom. Most heartbreaking of all was watching her books dwindle. The volumes that had once been her greatest comfort were now a luxury that her jailers could grant or withdraw at will. The girl who had found paradise in Plato now discovered that even intellectual escape could be denied to a prisoner of the crown. Each morning brought the same terrible question: would this be the day they came for her? In the winter of 1554, hope flickered briefly in Lady Jane Grey's world like a candle in a draught, bright enough to illuminate possibilities, fragile enough to be extinguished by the slightest breath of political wind. The salvation came from an unexpected source: rebellion. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a Protestant nobleman, had risen in revolt against Queen Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. The prospect of a Spanish Catholic king ruling England had ignited Protestant fury across the realm, and suddenly Lady Jane Grey, the Protestant queen who had been cast aside, became relevant again. For a few precious weeks, Jane's world expanded beyond her Tower prison. Wyatt's forces marched toward London, gathering supporters who chanted not for Mary but for Queen Jane and the Protestant cause. Inside her stone cell, Jane could hear the distant sounds of martial preparation, the clatter of hooves and armor that might herald her liberation. Letters reached her, carefully smuggled past her guards, speaking of Protestant lords, ready to restore her to the throne she had never wanted but might now desperately need. The cruel irony was not lost on Jane's brilliant mind. The crown she had reluctantly accepted was now her only hope of survival. If Wyatt succeeded, she would be queen again, this time with popular support and a righteous cause. If he failed, her brief association with his rebellion would likely seal her doom. There was no neutral ground for a Grey in Tudor England. For those fleeting moments, Jane allowed herself to imagine freedom. Perhaps she could rule as a proper Protestant queen, guided by wisdom rather than ambition, bringing the religious reform that Edward VI had died too young to complete. Perhaps her sufferings had not been meaningless. Perhaps God had preserved her for this moment of destiny. But hope in the Tower of London was always a luxury borrowed against terrible interest. When Wyatt's rebellion crumbled at the gates of London, when his supporters scattered like leaves before Mary's loyal forces, Jane knew with horrible certainty that her brief reprieve was over. The failed revolt had not freed her. It had simply provided Mary Tudor with the perfect justification for what she had perhaps always intended to do. The girl who had tasted hope for the first time in months now faced a far more bitter cup. February the 12th, 1554, dawned cold and merciless over the Tower of London. Lady Jane Grey woke knowing it would be her last morning on earth. The final blow had come not from Mary's cruelty, but from her own father's reckless ambition. Henry Grey's participation in Wyatt's rebellion had signed his daughter's death warrant in blood. The man who had beaten Jane into accepting marriage now condemned her to death through his own desperate gamble for power. Even facing the executioner's block, Jane could not escape the devastation wrought by her family's ambitions. In her final hours, Jane displayed the dignity that had always set her apart from the scheming nobles who had destroyed her life. She penned letters to her sister, Catherine, and her father, remarkable documents that revealed not bitterness but profound faith and forgiveness. To Henry Grey, the father who had betrayed her repeatedly, she wrote words of Christian love that demonstrated the nobility her enemies could never touch. As morning broke, Jane prepared for death with the same methodical care she had once brought to her studies. She dressed in black, the color of mourning but also of dignity. She tied her prayer book, the one comfort her jailers had allowed her to keep, to her belt. Inside its pages, she had written a final inscription to Sir John Bridges, the lieutenant of the Tower who had shown her kindness in her final weeks. From her window, Jane watched as they carried away Guildford Dudley's headless body on a rough cart. "Oh, Guildford, Guildford!" she cried, perhaps the only genuine emotion she had ever expressed for the husband who had been forced upon her. In that moment, the brilliant girl who had mastered 5 languages found herself reduced to the most primitive human response: grief. The walk to Tower Green was mercifully short. Jane carried herself with regal bearing, her back straight, her steps measured. The girl who had never wanted to be queen would at least die like one. As the February wind cut through the Tower grounds, she prepared to speak her final words to a world that had given her everything except the one thing she had truly wanted: the freedom to live her own life. "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same." With these words, spoken on a scaffold built from the ambitions of others, Lady Jane Grey concluded one of history's most devastating tragedies. The final irony of Jane's story lies not in her death, but in how history would remember her. The girl who had been manipulated by every adult in her life became, in death, a symbol of Protestant martyrdom. The reluctant queen who had ruled for 9 days became more powerful in the grave than she had ever been on the throne. Artists like Paul Delaroche would immortalize her final moments, transforming her execution into a scene of tragic beauty that would move viewers to tears for centuries. Yet even in martyrdom, Jane could not escape manipulation. Protestant propagandists seized upon her story, casting her as an innocent lamb sacrificed on the altar of Catholic tyranny. They conveniently overlooked the complex political machinations that had truly killed her, the ambitions of her father, the schemes of Northumberland, the brutal mathematics of Tudor succession. It was easier to blame Mary Tudor's bloody reign than to confront the uncomfortable truth that Jane had been destroyed by Protestant nobles as much as by Catholic queens. The questions that haunted Jane's brief life continue to haunt historians today. Was she truly as innocent as legend suggests, or did she understand more about her situation than she later claimed? Could her remarkable intelligence have found a way to escape the trap that destroyed her, or was she always doomed by forces beyond any individual's control? When you visit the Tower of London today and stand on Tower Green where she died, these questions seem to whisper from the very stones. Perhaps the most damning irony is that Jane's death solved nothing. Mary Tudor's reign would prove as tumultuous and bloody as any in English history. The religious conflicts that Jane's execution was meant to resolve would continue to tear England apart for generations. The girl who died to prevent chaos became simply another casualty of the very chaos her death was supposed to end. In the Chapel of St. Peter at Vincula, where Jane lies buried alongside Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, her grave bears no grand monument. Yet her story endures as a testament to a terrible truth. In the game of kings and queens, the most brilliant minds and gentlest hearts are often the first to be sacrificed. Was she ever truly free? History may never provide an answer, but the question itself ensures that Lady Jane Grey, England's forgotten queen, will never be forgotten.